call Colonel Nightingale up to the podium to introduce our guest. Thank you, Keith.
It's my very great privilege to introduce Jack H. Jacobs. He's the soldier guy as opposed to the numbers guy over there. While Jack H. was losing his taste buds in the Delta, this Jack was fighting off the hordes at Berkeley. One got a Purple Heart, the other one didn't. I will dispense with a normal introduction because you can all read what the basic bio is on internet or whatever else. I like to talk on a more personal basis about the nature and character of the person we're privileged to talk about today. He's got a couple of Bronze Stars, 2 Silver Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, several Purple Hearts, and a Medal of Honor. You all know that. But that's not the most important thing about him that you might understand. He is one of the few people that has a building named after him at Rutgers, his alma mater. He was a frequent guest on Imus in the Morning and more than held his own. When he left the Army and went into banking, he was one of the first to manage bundling as a financial tool. He is presently an expert opinionator on NBC and MSNBC. I first met him, he and I together were platoon leaders in B Company 2505. We both were notorious for having very bad attitudes and for being cynical beyond our years. Our families were close. We stayed together a great deal, went on vacations and trips. My son dumped a bowl of spaghetti on his son's head, and he spanked my son. Now, how close can a family be? I visited his folks in New Jersey and met a loving and extended family where they introduced me to good beer and perhaps the finest fish restaurant in America at that time, Sloppy Louie's at the Fulton Fish Market, which no longer exists. Later, we were in the infantry advance course at Fort Benning, and the two of us managed to demolish the entire officers club structure. They had something then called the all-you-can-eat lobster night on Fridays, as I recall. And in a very boring leadership class, Jack and I sat at the back of the room with cardboard cutouts of lobsters and figured out how many lobsters we could actually stack on the small 9-inch dinner plates that they served for lobster night. We came up with 13. So that Friday, Jack and I, with our families, went to lobster night, worked our geometry, and it was wonderful. We got it. The very next day, the officers club eliminated all-you-can-eat lobster night. That more is probably less important than what I consider the best example of his character. Toward the end of Vietnam, as a Medal of Honor winner, he fought over Milpersen's objections to go back to Vietnam when he didn't have to. Jack is a real soldier in every way. So with further ado, here's Jack.
Thanks, Keith. You know, there's a wide variety of things to talk about, and Keith and I didn't settle on anything necessarily to discuss, but maybe we thought we could generate some questions revolving around the current state of national security affairs. But we want to leave enough time for questions because we have an opinion on just about every subject. People's attention naturally is focused on what's happening in Ukraine, and there are a couple of interesting things to talk about with respect to that. The first is the astonishment that the Russian failure to overwhelm Ukraine in about 10 seconds was greeted with the activity, and the Russians vastly outnumbering the Ukrainians and having a tremendous advantage in equipment, men and materiel. actually turned out to get themselves bogged down. And it's worthwhile to take a look at why that's so. The Russians always have done things differently than we have taught our soldiers to do in the West. We have combined arms attacks. Tanks just don't go out by themselves, and infantry don't go out by themselves. We coordinate infantry, armor, artillery, logistics, intelligence, air power into one cohesive unit and attack with all of them supporting each other. We lean into our artillery and air power, so much so that I recall circumstances in Vietnam in which we actually took casualties from our own supporting fires, both ground fire and air fire, because we leaned into that fire to keep the enemy's head down while we were trying to scramble on top of their position. Well, the Russians didn't do any of that stuff. You may recall that they came down a two-lane highway to try to get to Kiev and encircle it, and of course got destroyed piecemeal. When they attack, they would send indirect fire onto the objective. Then that would stop. Then they'd send the tanks in, and the tanks would get killed. Then they send in the infantry by themselves, and they would get killed. And it's not surprising, therefore, that they got run out of the northern part of Ukraine and had to focus their attention on the Donbass. They've now taken up defensive positions. And we know from experience, and it's our doctrine, that you have to have a minimum of a 3-to-1 ratio, attacker to defender, in order to overcome the enemy in defensive positions. And this is exacerbated by the long amount of time that the Russians have had to establish minefields and all the rest of it. It's not surprising, therefore, that the long-awaited Ukrainian offensive has not materialized in having a result whereby the Ukrainians have punched through the Russian lines. In addition to that, the Ukrainians seem to be dissipating a lot of their combat power along a long front in eastern Ukraine, when in fact what they ought to be doing is focusing their attention on the weakest part of the Russian line, then swarm through and encircle the Russians. It remains to be seen whether or not they will actually wind up doing that. But as a minimum, the Ukrainians are waiting for more fire support. I mean, they need more ammunition, more indirect fire platforms. And of course, they're making a big deal out of F-16s, and we can talk about that a little bit too. So there's something of a stalemate at the moment. There are local successes the Ukrainians are having, but the casualties are mounting up on both sides. For the Russians, for their part, have decided that they are in a position now to outweight the West. They, like the Chinese do in the Western Pacific, are playing the long game. They feel that ultimately the West is going to get tired of financing the Ukrainian military establishment, tired of financing the counterattacks, and eventually the West's support will dissipate, especially in circumstances in which leaders in the West might get elected who are opposed to continuing to support the Ukrainians. And they figure that they'll just wait us out. To the extent that that weakened leaders in the West will do that, they're probably right. But at the end of the day, it's possible that Kissinger was right when he said at the very beginning of the war, this war, that he thought that the ultimate result would be a negotiated settlement of some kind, whereby the Russians would agree to leave in exchange for keeping part of Donbass and all of Crimea. I mean, the Russians have always wanted not only to have it, but to hold on to it and create a land bridge from there to Moldova, control the Black Sea. Russians in fact perceive it to be a Russian lake, and be able to have access through the Dardanelles to the Mediterranean. As an aside, it's worthwhile noting that one of the reasons that they're have been heavily involved in Syria is to secure Mediterranean ports for their navy. In any case, things are slow going on the ground on both sides, and the casualties are mounting significantly. There was a recent estimate, I think you all saw, that there were 500,000 casualties killed and wounded total on both sides. That doesn't even count the civilians who've been killed and injured, and the general destruction that's take place inside Ukraine. So we can talk about more ground combat tactics and so on in questions, but the state of the situation is that it leaves a lot of people in the West, politicians in particular, with Ukraine fatigue, and that's what the Russians are hoping for. Obviously, one thing to talk about is Prigozhin. The interesting observation by a lot of people revolved around the notion that that Prigozhin was still alive after all this time, and that it took Putin this long to get rid of him. The Russians haven't changed a great deal in 1,000 years, whether it's Ivan the Terrible or Catherine the Great or Tsar Nicholas II or Putin. It's basically a top-down organization, and always has been and always will be. Whoever's at the top of the food chain it walks a tightrope, and it's possible that whoever that is liable to wake up dead one morning at any time. It's always been that way. I mean, Keith and I are old enough to remember when Stalin, in a meeting, himself killed Beria in the middle of a headquarters meeting. That sort of stuff has happened and probably always will continue to happen in Russia. It is a different place than any of us knows in the West, and will probably always be that way, especially certainly for Keith and my lifespan. Putin's on top of the heap as long as he is, and he won't be when people get fed up with him and get rid of him, and somebody else will rise to the top. I'm reminded of a really good movie I saw years and years ago called Viva Zapata, and it was all about Emiliano Zapata during in the latter part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century in Mexico, who was an illiterate peasant who rose more or less to the top of the food chain when Pancho Villa was in charge of everything, complained loudly and got to power because he complained loudly about the overbearing leadership in Mexico. And of course, when he got to be at the top of the food chain, he was just as overbearing as anybody else had been before him. And Russia's no different than that. Putin may or may not survive, but at the end of the day, be careful of what you wish for, because the whoever replaces him might be even worse. I remember some years ago when Ahmadinejad was nominally in charge of Iran, people were complaining loudly about what a creep he was and all the rest. And of course, he didn't last forever either. It's interesting to note that at the time, a lot of people were saying, be careful of what you wish for. Ahmadinejad is the liberal in Iran. And comparatively speaking, they were right. There's also a great deal of concern what's happening inside China and outside China. People who are allies of ours, Japan and Korea, Philippines and others, and even those who were enemies of ours, including Vietnam, they've all been screaming for a long time about our reluctance to confront China in China's relentless expansion in the Western Pacific, and that they were very much concerned that we could not be relied upon to come to their aid and defense if, as and when China decided to invade. And there was a lot to be concerned about because we constantly make noises as if it's the late 30s, for example, when we were as isolationist as we possibly could be, and said that with the president of the United States at the time getting on radio saying, we're not going to fight in Europe, European boys are going to fight in Europe. We're not going to fight in Asia, Asian boys are going to fight in Asia, and we're just going to take care of ourselves, all at the behest of the America First mob. And at the end of the day, it took an attack on Pearl Harbor to get us to pull our heads out and get serious about defending our global interests and the interests of our allies. There's a great deal of concern, especially given a lot of the comments made among American politicians in the last dozen years or so. A lot of concern in the Western Pacific about our interest in defending them. We're a little bit better at that now, but there's still a great deal of consternation when they perceive that at any time the United States can decide to be less supportive of our global interests. And the Chinese certainly, their economic difficulties notwithstanding, are working very, very hard to establish themselves in a lot of places, but in particular in the Western Pacific. They have the largest Navy in the world. Keith and I remember back when we were in the Army of our talking about having a 600 ship Navy. Today we have 253 capital ships. Now, to be sure, they're much more capable than they were back in the day, but suffice to say that we have an inadequate naval presence where we need to have it, and that happens to be everywhere. In addition to that, modern technology has made it extremely difficult for surface ships to figure out how they're going to survive in an intense battle, naval battlefield. And so one of the results is an intense focus on making stronger our submarine fleet, both nuclear fast attack submarines on the one hand and ballistic missile submarines on the other. At the end of the day, they might wind up being the only ships, the only naval capability that will be survivable in a difficult environment. With respect to Taiwan, there's a great deal of consternation, particularly on Taiwan, about whether or not the Chinese are going to attack. The smart money says that the Chinese are also in it for the long game, and that they don't have to attack Taiwan because, among other things, they're concerned about the United States and the rest of the world will do, but also because they don't have to. A recent poll inside Taiwan, where the average age is, I'll be hyperbolic and say it's 17 years old, but it's quite young. A recent poll said that they don't care. The majority of people below a certain age don't remember 1949, would prefer to be aligned with a strong economic power, and would voluntarily become part of China if given the opportunity to do so. That is probably a bit hyperbolic, but at the end of the day, the Chinese perceive that time is on their side. They don't have to bite the American tail in order to get Taiwan. They may inherit it automatically sometime in the future. In addition to that, China at the moment has got some difficult economic circumstances, as you know, and there's huge economic retrenchment. There's enormous deflation in assets. There's a giant real estate bubble that has already burst and has not finished expelling all its air. So China has some real economic problems at the moment. And before everybody gets, it's easy to have this feeling of schadenfreude, but at the end of the day, Economically, the world is inextricably intertwined with China. It's the second largest economy. If it has real problems, then the rest of the world's economy has problems, certainly over the short term, including the United States. I mean, we're a big economy, but economic shockwaves inside China don't do us any good. And if there's to be a soft landing anywhere, we would like it to be in China. However, the Chinese are having a great deal of problems trying to right their economic ship. And it remains to be seen whether or not they're not going to be successful over the short term, which is going to be deleterious to the rest of the world's economy. Over the longer term, they might be. But China's got economic problems. One last thing about China, in the past, when China's been has been internally weak, it has not been expansive. And when it's been strong, it's been expanding all over the place. In modern times, with technology being what it is and so on, it might very well be that the economic difficulties inside China might be the very thing that would cause them to direct attention outside China. We hope not, we think not, but you never know what autocratic people have a tendency to do. One last thing I'll throw out geopolitically, and that's Africa. A large proportion of our strategic materials come from places like Africa and places in Africa, but the Chinese and the Russians are working very hard to engender support among African countries for them so that they can continue to have access and have increased access to strategic materials. This is of great concern to us, and one of the reasons why we created a command to focus its attention on Africa. But at the end of the day, we don't have any, it's difficult to envision how we would put together plans that would include the use of the military instrument of power in order to gain influence inside Africa. That's a work in progress, and we're not very far along in developing that work. One last thing I'll throw out there for consideration, and that is the state of our forces. When Keith and I came into the Army, we had a draft. My father had been a student studying electrical engineering at the University of Minnesota when he was summarily dragooned into, he and everybody else in his class, dragged into the Army about 8 weeks from graduation. And he fought in the Army in New Guinea and the Philippines in the South Pacific. Hated getting dragged out of school, hated the Army, hated getting shot at. Nobody likes that. And he got out of the Army the instant that he could when the war was over. And yet when he got to be our age, all he would talk about was how proud he was of having saved the world. And he and his generation had done exactly that. Today, we've decided that we are going to outsource the defense of the Republic to a very small number of young men and women who are willing to do it. You're looking at somebody who believes in universal service. I always thought that if you live in a free country, you owe it something in the form of service. But we don't have the political will to do it. And that's why we have a volunteer force. Consider this. More people were killed in New York City on 9/11 than were killed at Pearl Harbor in 1941, a place where most people didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was. Indeed, Hawaii didn't even become a state until Keith and I were in high school. We just don't have the political will to have universal service. Finland has universal service. Switzerland has universal service. The United States has more threats, more interests around the world than we can possibly count. We don't have universal service. And we're having trouble convincing kids to serve as a result of its being not an obligation because you're free and you need to stay free, because you need to keep faith with the people who sacrificed before you to give you the freedom that you enjoy, but because it's monetarily attractive. It's not working, and it shouldn't work anyway. but it gives us great pause when we have a hard time recruiting people to serve the rest of the country. And I don't know whether or not this figure is accurate, but it's probably pretty close. At the last time the Army reported its success in recruiting soldiers, we were shy by about 20%. It may even be more than that, but I think that's the figure that I recall. We can't long sustain the ability to defend ourselves if that's the situation in which we put ourselves. We don't have the political will to do anything else, but it's sad to think that something even more catastrophic than 9/11 has to occur before we get serious about defending ourselves. That's probably enough to chew on. I'd be happy to take questions on this and any other subject of any kind.
Jack, if I could lead off, could you give us your view of the difference between, call it the Biden administration toward our overall objectives in the Ukraine and what Zelensky's may be, and if there are any significant differences?
Well, I think writ large, there are no significant differences. If there was, I forget who it was. It was Lewis Carroll, I think. I think it was Lewis Carroll who wrote in Through the Looking Glass, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. It was absolutely right. We learn in the military that you need to start at the end and work backwards. What is your objective? If you can't answer you can't answer that question, you have no business allocating resources for any reason. You need to, as a matter of fact, in the military, you can't get a private no-class dog face to do anything unless you first tell them what it is you're trying to accomplish. That's one of the things that makes us as good as we are, even under these circumstances. So what needs to be articulated is what the objective is. Nobody's going to tell us what it is in the bowels of the Pentagon, in the tank, in the White House. It's likely that the overall objective of the United States is pretty much the same thing as that of Ukraine. But how you achieve it then becomes much more difficult. It's my belief that the leadership in the United States is willing to, if we were in the same situation as Zelensky, that we would fight to the death, and that's what Zelensky wants to do. But if you're at a great distance, as we are from Ukraine, it becomes very, very easy to tell the other guy how he should negotiate to end the hostilities. And it may very well be that we're working very hard to do that, to convince Zelensky to fight to a stalemate if necessary, if he can't punch through, and take all the terrain back and hold it. It's a bit like the Seinfeld observation that taking the reservations, anybody can take the reservation. It's holding on to it that you need to do. It's easy to take the objective sometimes, but you got to be able to hold on to it. And the United States is not entirely convinced that Ukraine, even if it did take back Donbass and even Crimea, would be able to hold on to it. And so the folks inside the Pentagon are probably trying to figure out how they'll be able to convince Zelensky to negotiate some sort of settlement in the end. And I think that has been the American objective ever since the beginning of the war, to encourage and assist Ukraine to defeat in detail the Russians, but failing that, to reach some sort of negotiated settlement. Now, your question brings up the whole question of the vituperative discussion over F-16s. Initially, we weren't going to give any aircraft to these guys because we didn't like the optics of American F-16s getting shot down over Ukraine. let alone Russia, and give the Ukrainians capability to strike inside Russia and therefore drag us unceremoniously into the war and all the rest of that stuff. I think we've changed our mind. As a matter of fact, some of our allies already agreed to give the F-16s to the Ukrainians. But the trouble is, it's not going to be there are two things about it. The first is they're not going there anytime soon. Part of the problem is it takes about a year to take a qualified pilot and turn them into an F-16 pilot. And second, you got to be able to speak English. And the Ukrainians do not have a plethora of pilots who speak English. So it's going to take a much longer time to get these aircraft over to assist the Ukrainians. But I think the objectives are still the same. Eject the Russians if you can, but agree to some sort of settlement if you cannot. Because I think the United States perceives that ultimately we're not going to be able to keep the Congress fully engaged in supporting the Ukrainians for the next 10 years or so. So it turns out it's not a military problem per se. Like everything else, like Clausewitz once argued about the use of the military instrument, it's a political problem.
I got a question back to China. After seeing Oppenheimer, my nuclear anxieties have been re-triggered. And I'm wondering if South Korea and Japan don't have the confidence that we're going to back them up, whether they're going to fast track their nuclear programs. What is the likelihood of that?
I think it's greater than zero. I think no matter what we say, I don't think our allies in the Western Pacific believe that if push comes to shove, we're going to come to their defense. And of course, in Japan, it takes a constitutional change. And in South Korea, they've got the specter of North Korea developing nuclear weapons and already having nuclear weapons, and are doubly concerned that we're not going to come to their aid. You know, it's really kind of interesting. The Chinese. Somebody asked one time, why are the Chinese supporting North Korea? They're a bunch of morons. Well, the Chinese don't care very much for North Korea, don't care much for the Kim regime. I mean, the whole family. But the problem is that if the North Korean regime goes to pieces, 3 to 4 million North Koreans are going to stream across the Yalu River into China, and the Chinese don't want that. By the way, to that extent, the Chinese have already built refugee camps inside China for North Korean refugees, should they come. And there's enough room for 1.2 million of them so far, and they're continuing to build. No, I think your perception is right. It's one thing for us to say that we're going to come to their defense. They don't have to believe it, and they don't fully believe it. That's why. Thus, the recent trip to the region and an assertion that we're in it together and all the rest of it, as Benjamin Franklin once said just before the revolution, we either hang together or we will surely hang separately. But I don't think either the Japanese or the South Koreans believe it 100%, and they want insurance of some kind. And you may be right.
I'd like to ask a question to see if you could speak to the economic slowdown in China. I've read a bunch of interesting articles about the one-child birth policy until 2015, then 2 after 16 to 21 announced at 3, and that in the next 10 years, the Chinese will have this overwhelming amount of their population be retirees, basically not working and or military capable. And will that, I think you kind of spoke to it earlier, but I'm just curious, is that what's causing a large part of the economic slowdown, and will that hopefully buy us some time in a time period where they wouldn't seek to be expansionary otherwise, because they just don't have the human resources to be able to do that in the next decade, say?
Well, that demographic problem is one that is shared with lots of other countries as well, by the way. Even in the United States, we have a birth slowdown. I've got half a dozen grandchildren, and 4 of them are in their 20s, and they're not married, and They're with the same people for 5 years, and they have no intention of getting married. No, that's a peculiar problem. That's at least partially a function of the baby boom that caused Keith and me, and the result of that, where the birth rate has gone down. And it's true in a lot of countries, but most significantly in China, exacerbated by the one-child policy. But the current economic, that's a longer term time bomb, actually. The real economic difficulty right now is the primary cause is a real estate bubble. And that was exacerbated by manipulating the interest rates incorrectly inside China. And the result is enormous swaths of land given over to real estate developments that were constructed willy-nilly and are completely and totally unoccupied, totally empty, unfinished, a lot of them. So much capital has been pumped into that sector that has not brought any returns to the investors, that has caused enormous lack of consumer confidence now. So one of the things that's happened is that Chinese people are not willing to spend money. They're hoarding their money, what money they have. Because they're hoarding their money and not, but let me back up a second. The American economy, by and large, is driven by consumer purchases. Well, it's in most developed economies, including that of China, it's the same thing. So with consumers not purchasing like they used to, producers are not producing. And so they've laid off a substantial part of the workforce, which has now resulted in significant unemployment, which exacerbates the interest of the consumers to buy anything because there's less money to buy stuff. And turns out to be a self-fulfilling problem, and it will get worse unless and until the Chinese government does something about it. It's got to make, in theory, one of the ways to do this is to make money more available. We saw this in 2008 in the United States when the American government just printed money and handed it out, and that did have an exculpatory effect on the economy. Well, the Chinese haven't done that yet, and their economy is going to get more difficult over the near term because of both the real estate bubble and the lack of consumer confidence, which is going down every minute.
I'm curious what you think the effect of Tommy Tuberville's holdup on military promotions is having on the armed forces.
Well, the people the holdup is not having a deleterious effect on morale. People might think it does, but it doesn't. At the end of the day, it's all going to get resolved in some way, and it's interesting to note that people like Tuberville would think that would have a big impact on other decisions that are made in the Congress, because it doesn't. I remember I didn't get promoted for a long period of time because of something like that years and years ago, and we all just carried on. It's the real problem. That's not the problem. It's a symptom of a problem, of a much bigger problem, and that is that there's no discipline among the parties. Everybody does whatever the heck he wants, and instead of having two parties, we have 535 of them, I suppose, and anybody can do anything he wants. This ought to result in a change in the rules in the Senate, but probably will not. And so we're going to see this sort of stuff time and time again. I don't know how many times Keith and I have seen a looming debt crisis because we decided we're not going to pay, we're not going to extend the debt ceiling. I mean, it's got to have happened about half a dozen times that I can remember. and it eventually gets resolved. And all it does is demonstrate how inept are the majority of people who you elect to office. So that's got to be fixed, but it probably won't be.
I have a question. In the Ukraine situation, is the effect of unmanned drones having much an effect?
Well, it's had an enormous effect on how you operate in the field now. And of course, that technology is developing still further, even as we're sitting here. It's really quite astonishing what you can accomplish with unmanned vehicles. And a lot of these things that the Ukrainians are using are homemade. I mean, they figured out how to do it themselves. And they are. I mean, they're not as accurate, and they don't have to carry the charges that that bigger ones do, but they're not as expensive either, and they can be made in the basement. So they're continuing to persevere in that, but it does bring up the question that you're asking, and is the development of this kind of technology, is that changing how we operate on the ground? Well, if you take a look at the forward edge of the battle area in Ukraine, it doesn't look like it's changed it very much. I mean, if you run out of artillery ammo, I guess you can probably send a kamikaze drone into a site and that you identify and all the rest of that stuff. The large majority of drones that are used on the Russian side have been to attack civilian targets in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are far smarter. They're focusing their attention based on intelligence that we, the Brits, the Israelis, and others give them about the locations of ammo dumps, command and control headquarters, and logistical installations, all these things that need to be attacked. We're giving this information, they're attacking it with drones and rockets and so on, but increasingly with drones. But if you think about a war that's not like this war, where there isn't more or less a static forward edge of the battle area, where there's a lot of movement and a lot more troops on the ground, and maybe for the United States, a lot more at stake, it gives us pause. I mentioned earlier the vulnerability of surface ships. Well, drones, we saw the USS Cole pretty much destroyed by a rubber boat full of explosives. Well, I mean, make believe, and we saw the Moskva, the Russian capital ship sunk in the Black Sea. That's something to consider, and it gives the Navy a great amount of pause. How are you going to defend against drones when you have enormous targets like aircraft carriers floating around? It becomes extremely difficult. Your air defenses have to be far more sophisticated than just sending a bunch of airplanes up. You're going to have to find other ways to bring drones down because your capital ships are really at risk. Large formations of troops on the ground. I mean, before we attack, we always get into an assembly area. Troops are concentrated. We have artillery locations all over the place. They're concentrated. They're sitting targets for drones if the enemy has the intelligence to send them. And these are low-cost ways in which to destroy American allied enemy troops. Yes, the preponderance of drones and the prospect of more drones in a battle area is changing the way in which we think about war on the ground and on the sea in particular.
Recent statistics in the LA Times published that, for example, Ukraine is firing off 1,500 artillery shells a day. Our capacity to produce artillery shells is between 200 and 250. This is expanded out in the article to say that we're depleting our own military resources to a dangerous level. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, anytime you fire ammunition, you take it from national stocks, it depletes it. We haven't had the manufacturing lines up until the war started because we didn't think that we were going to need all this ammunition. So they're now ginned up again. Our allies are generating more ammunition as well. 1,500 a day is not very much, to be honest with you. I remember an attack that I conducted in my second tour in Vietnam. I was with the 1st Vietnamese Airborne Battalion, and we were attacking a hill about 600 meters to our front. And I remember the pre-strike like it was yesterday. 5,000 rounds of 105 millimeter artillery ammo, 1,000 rounds of 155 millimeter artillery ammo, and 100 rounds of 175 millimeter artillery ammo coming from those old long toms that the Marines used in the Second World War, all on top of a hilltop that was probably not a whole lot bigger than the plot that my house sits on. So 1,500 rounds is not enough. It's not very much. However, if you don't have a lot of ammo, 1,500 is a lot. And we are behind the 8 ball in manufacturing indirect fire ammunition, which is one reason why the Ukrainians are increasingly using HIMARS and similar systems, because we don't have enough artillery ammo to supply their needs. But the manufacturing capability will catch up at the end of the day, because the Ukrainians, 1,500 rounds, not very much. If they were making an attack, they'd use 10 times as much. Right now, they're just probing along the forward edge of the battle area and are not making large-scale inroads into Russian territory. If, as and when they do that, they're going to need a lot more ammo than they've been using up until now, which is one reason why they may not be doing it, and may wait until later on this calendar year or next spring to really launch an offensive.
Jack, I want to compliment your parents on picking the name Jack Jacobs, because we both share that honor, I guess. I have a question regarding your comments about toppling dictators. And so my question relates to Putin, and where is the power in Russia to do such a thing?
Well, it's funny you should mention that. I was talking with somebody about that very subject just yesterday. The power lies, you would think, lies among the oligarchs. And of course, there is truth in that. If the oligarchs decide that Putin is not their man, they'll get somebody else in there, one of them or somebody else we've never heard of or we haven't been thinking of. But we have to remember one thing, that the oligarchs themselves owe all their fortunes to Putin. Indeed, everything that they have is not theirs anyway. It's, at least in every case, is at least half Putin's. And if they decide they want to get rid of Putin, they could easily do it. I mean, the Russians have gotten rid of leaders with great alacrity, as you know, in the past, up until just the other day. Who they put in there, it'll have to be an agreement among them. You remember when after Stalin, there was going to be a troika, and after Khrushchev, there was going to be a troika. And at the end of the day, somebody rose to the top because the balance of power shifted to one guy. This will happen when Putin goes too, one way or the other. It'll be one guy. Everybody will support, but in the end, that guy might not last either. But the power lies among the oligarchs if they choose to use it. At the moment, it doesn't behoove them to do that because they're doing extremely well with Putin in the driver's seat. Here's an interesting thing to consider. The two guys at the top of the military food chain, Shoigu and Gerasimov, they've both been in their jobs for 14, each has been in this job for 14 years. Now, we have we have people who rise to the top of the food chain, the American military establishment, and they stay in their jobs for 5 years or whatever it happens to be, and then they go, then they retire, and somebody else comes up who's been working his way through the bureaucracy. That doesn't happen inside Russia. In Russia, you stay, no matter how competent or incompetent you are, you stay in your job until you either fall from a great height or ingest some poison, or something else befalls you and you're replaced by somebody else who then stays in the job for a long period of time. If the boss goes, somebody else rises to the top, and all of his cronies then replace all the cronies who leave. It's difficult to understand from our standpoint because we don't do business that way. If I tell you, it resembles nothing so much as the Senate, I suppose, the U.S. Senate. But in the end, people just, like MacArthur said, in the United States, just fade away. In Russia, they don't fade away; they go out with a bang.
All right, Jack, can you hear me?
Yeah, barely.
Okay, one last question. Putting on your pontificating hat, based on what we think today, what do you think the ultimate outcome of the Ukraine will be?
If I'm a betting man now, yeah. Look, my heart's with the Ukrainians overwhelming the poorly trained, poorly led, and they are poorly trained and poorly led Russians. Just as an aside, if we give an operations order to a bunch of low-ranking enlisted soldiers in the United States Army, and we tell them, what we want you to do is to go there, and then when you get there, we want you to turn right. And they go there and they can't turn right. There's too much fire coming from the right. And so they turn left. I mean, they figure it out at the point of decision. The lowest ranking American soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine can figure it out because he's got not only the authority, but the responsibility to do that, to make a decision on the spot. Russian soldiers may not do that. One of the reasons the Russians have lost so many generals is because they have no non-commissioned officer corps worthy of the name. Oh, they got non-commissioned officers, but they're not allowed to make decisions. Their officer corps below the rank of about colonel and maybe even brigadier general, they're not allowed to make decisions either. They're not allowed to change any order. So their officer corps isn't worth anything. And their troops are not trained properly. And they're trained in all the wrong tactics, as we discussed earlier. The result is that it's possible, indeed we pray, that the Ukrainians will, across a wide front, eject the Russians from everywhere inside Ukraine. The smart money says that this is going to drag on for a while, and ultimately there will be a negotiated settlement. That the Ukrainians will agree to give up Crimea. They've been working hard to take it back, I must say. They'll agree to give up Crimea and part of Donbass in exchange for the Russians leaving. But at the end of the day, it might not come to that. It may be that Zelensky will say, no, if you guys in the West are not going to support us, we will fight to the death. And one hopes that that's what they will do. So we hope that they'll get rid of the Russians altogether, but there may be a negotiated settlement of some kind down the road because, as the Russians hope, the West might wind up getting tired and decide not to support it anymore, not to the extent that we have been up until now. Somebody said recently, I can't remember on the air, well, there's a third option, and that is that the Russians get fed up with Putin and he gets something, he also falls from a great height. And I'll reiterate something I suggested earlier. Be careful of what you wish for, the guy who replaces him might be worse yet. Somebody earlier mentioned the concern about nuclear weapons in the Western Pacific. I mean, one has to be concerned about nuclear weapons in Europe too. So we hope they get rid of them, but if they don't, there'll be a negotiated settlement of some kind.
Colonel Jacobs, thank you for that insight, and we really appreciate your time spent with us.
No, it's my great pleasure. Thank you.
I just want to mention again that next Friday we are dark. That's September 1st in preparation for Labor Day. Also, I'd like to thank Fern for a little play on music, or what she called noodling. And hopefully we can make that a feature, at the beginning of meetings. Anyway, I have a final thought. Earn your success based on service to others, not at the expense of others. H. Jackson Brown. And this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Keith.
Thank you, Jack. You can go back to bed.
Call on me anytime, buddy. Good to see you.
Airborne.
All the way.